All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very excited about today's virtual book launch for This is the Plate, Utah Food Traditions. One, because I love food, two, because I love Utah, and three, because I love this book. If you are currently not speaking, please mute your mic so we don't have any extra background noise. So a little bit about this book. This is the first book-length treatment of Utah's distinctive food heritage. Has more than 60 subject matter experts in it. It features recipes and photography of food and beverages. And it has 5 different sections, and we have all 3 editors with us today and a speaker from each section. And these sections are official foods and icons, heritage, Latter-day Saint influence, local specialties, and food waste today. So I'm going to read the bios of the speakers, and I'm going to do it quickly so we can get into the meat of the matter. First, and I'm reading them in order of their speaking. So first is Eric Eliason, is professor of folklore at Brigham Young University and a former chaplain for the 1st Battalion 19th Special Forces Group. He has written and co-written many books. Lynne McNeil holds a PhD in folklore from Memorial University of Newfoundland and serves as chair of the folklore program in the English department at Utah State University. Carol Edison retired as director of the folk arts program of the Utah Arts Council in 2011. For 33 years, she conducted fieldwork in Utah's Native American rural, occupational, and ethnic communities. Michael Christensen is a public sector folklorist described as the visual and performing arts manager for the West Valley Arts. Brock Cheney is the author of Plain But Wholesome, Foodways of the Mormon Pioneers. He lives in Willard, Utah, where he tends a vegetable garden, tests historical recipes, and bakes bread in a wood-fired brick oven. Kathryn MacKay is currently a professor of history and the director of the public history program at Weber State University. She serves on the Ogden City Landmarks Commission and on the Utah Humanities Board. David Allred is a professor of English and philosophy at Snow College, where he serves as interim dean of humanities. He teaches composition, literature, and folklore and is a former board chair of Utah Humanities. Jill Terry Rudy is Associate Professor of English at Brigham Young University and edited The Marrow of Human Experience, Essays on Folklore by William A. Wilson, and in 2020 co-authored Fairy Tale TV in the Routledge Television Guidebook series with Pauline Greenhill. So now let's dip into some of this yummy food. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I've been tasked with telling what we folklorists like to call the etiological legend of the origin of the book. It was at a Folklore Society of Utah meeting that was a little bit less than a decade ago. It's a wonderful event that Utah folklorists and students are involved in, and sometimes magical things happen. We were eating at the Black Sheep Cafe, which ends up featured in the book. And I had been thinking about, we really ought to do a book on Utah foods. And I went, which we were eating at the table, I went to talk to Lynne, and I said, hey, Lynne, I'm thinking about doing this book on Utah foods, and would you like to co-edit this? And I think before I even finished the sentence, Lynne was like, yes, let's do. And what Lynne and I didn't know is that Carol Edison was there, and she overheard this conversation and starts sending us emails that quickly demonstrate that she knows more about Utah foods than either one of us put together. And through her many years as a folklorist with the Utah Arts Council, she had built up this amazing network of contacts and amazing knowledge base and amazing access to pictures that she and her team there at the Chase home had made over the years, and access to Utah History Society. So Lynne, I think, is going to tell you a little bit about how the book has developed somewhat from there. But I did want to say something about the editorial team, in that we joke around sometimes that with Lynn as a Gentile, and Carol as a Jack Mormon, and me as well, you know, I work at BYU, go figure. We've got basically all of Utah's important demographic groups well covered. And you know, this is one of the ways in which Utah is different and distinct, is the importance of religion. And one of the things that we were super keen from the get-go is important as Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saint experience is in a book on Utah folklore, and it's going to inform that. This is a book on Utah food, and rather than Latter-day Saint food. And if we have time and people are interested, might talk a little bit later about why it seems to be so well developed. And we have some theories on that come up in the book, and maybe we'll spoil them for those of you who haven't read the book yet. Maybe we won't. You'll have to wait and see. But I've got just one picture I want to show, then I'll do Lynn. This is a slide that I show to my students in my folklore class when I talk about Utah foods, and this is kind of setting the stage of how Utah food traditions are similar and different than others around the country. And I'm kicking myself still to this day and have to make this geographically correct. I've got at the top, I've got the Boston baked beans on the left, and the Bay Area, San Francisco sourdough bread on the right. It should be the other way around. That bugs me, and my OCD is bugging me. Down below that, you can see New York versus Chicago style pizza. The same with New York versus Chicago style hot dogs. And if you notice, these signature food items are associated with cities more than a whole state. And sometimes, like on the far right and the bottom right, you see examples of food from whole integrated cuisines of various states. So there's you go to New Mexico, you can get Mexican food, and you can also get New Mexican food, and there are slight differences there, and it's not just one item, it's a whole cuisine. And of course, Texas and Louisiana across the bottom each have several wholly integrated cuisines. And if you go through, there's many states, not just one, where you can get a plate of fried catfish and collard greens and maybe some grits on the side. But what struck me as distinct about Utah is the number of individual iconic food items that are unique to Utah that do not necessarily constitute a whole cuisine. But I will pass the time off to Lynn here, and there's a lot of really interesting people who have stuff to talk about this book. I look forward to hearing it myself.
Well, I'll just jump in then and say thank you to everyone for being here. This is so wonderful to see so much interest in this project. And this project has been going for so long. I know that there were many people, including our own contributors, who were like, were they kidding about this? And no, clearly we weren't. And also clearly it was worth the wait. This final product is so awesome. It's my Christmas gift to everyone this year. So it's exciting to see it in its final form. But I did want to talk just a little bit about how it grew, because, you know, Eric's original idea, which, as he points out, I was just immediately enthusiastic about, why hasn't someone done this yet? I think the initial conception was that it might be a sort of typical reader, an academic collection of essays that in a foodways class we might give to students, but that would have some general readership appeal to people from Utah or visiting Utah or something like that. But as we began thinking about what we would need to include, it just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because everything we'd, again, kind of, well, you can't have a book about Utah foods and not talk about fry sauce, like, and really talk about it. But then we're sort of saying, but does there need to be like a 35-page in-depth theoretical article on fry sauce? Like, does that make sense either? So it sort of ballooned out, where we found ourselves going, are we talking about an encyclopedia of Utah food culture? And we owe it, of course, to the press, who immediately said, no, you're not thinking about an encyclopedia. No one wants to read an encyclopedia. So we reined that back in, and ended up coming to this, what I think is just such a wonderful and fruitful format, where we've sort of managed to do all of the above. Mike Christensen, who is here with us today, will show you how much there actually is to say about fry sauce, which is quite a bit, and it's quite meaningful, it turns out. And that's awesome that we could fit that in. And we do have some long form pieces where we get in depth and show the academic weight of what can happen when we talk about Utah food culture. And we have some entries that are maybe no more than a captioned photo or a short paragraph, but we wanted those pieces in there, because as we would talk about this book, and this is part of what added to the longevity of the process, was you get people talking about Utah food and they start throwing out, well, of course you're including this, and of course you're including this, and we're just sort of taking notes like, oh yeah, of course, we'll have a whole chapter on that. And we really wanted Utahns of all stripes to recognize themselves in this book. And I think that goal, I hope, was achieved in as much as it is possible. And I think we ended up with something that is both academically rigorous and enjoyable to read. I mean, it has recipes in it. I that's a reason to buy this book and to learn about as Eric has pointed out, we don't expect Utah to have a food culture, but it has more than one, and it is incredibly exciting, and you will learn a lot about it from this book. So I will turn things over to Carol Edison, our fearless expert. Yeah.
Carol, I think you're on mute.
Okay, am I still on mute?
No, we can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Thanks to both of you. You're wonderful. It's been fun to work on this project with you. Good afternoon to everyone. Happy to be to this point in this project and to be involved in this new way of launching books. What an exciting thing. The things I tried to bring to the publication were to make it more comprehensive and inclusive, as the others have talked about. Starting with food traditions I'd learned while doing field work in Utah. A couple of quick examples of that are chili sauce that everybody makes out in Grouse Creek, which is on the west side of Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake. It's almost Nevada, almost Idaho. Everybody makes chili sauce out there, and I grew up with chili sauce. Yeah, we used to put it on meatloaf, but those guys out in Grouse Creek put it on everything. And as it turned out, just about everybody was using a variation of the same recipe. So all of a sudden, that becomes a real marker of identity in Grouse Creek. Similar story could be told about Dixie salad down in the southwestern part of the state. And it's called Dixie salad because it uses local produce. It uses the pecans and the pomegranates that are two of the low elevation crops that are unique in Utah to that area. It's basically a Waldorf salad, chopped up apples with whipped cream and, of course, the pomegranate seeds and the pecans. We finally found a picture of it.
Couple of
There
things.
we go, on the bottom. Yeah, down the bottom left, yes. The thing that was interesting in doing research about that, trying to find out how widespread that food tradition was, is I went online a number of times, and every single time I found the recipe and found it called Dixie salad, it was from somebody who lived either in Washington County, just across the border in Nevada, or in their bio talked about that's where they grew up. So another really distinctive Utah food tradition. Beyond that, I started looking at some of the commercial foods that I'd heard about all my life. It's like Green River melons. Everybody has to know what Green River melons are, so they had to be included. And pickle pie from Bicknell. Now that's something that the Travel Council has pushed forever, or at least they did back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I knew about pickle pie before I knew where Bicknell was. So it was fun to try and include some of those things. Then there are other food traditions that I grew up with that may or may not be very widespread, but I know that they were important to the community I lived in. Things like Snellgrove Snellies, basically a melt nickel without a stick, or Spud Nuts. And of course, they had more national run. They were actually started in, it was either southern Idaho or northern Utah. But, you know, those are the things you have to include to make sure that this resonates as being the real thing. Let's see. There was one thing I really wanted to include that we never could find a spot for, and that was choke cherry jelly. So I'll mention that here. I remember going with my mother to gather choke cherries up in East Canyon every year when I was a kid, and she made this amazingly sweet sour jelly that was great, but nope, no choke cherry jelly in the book. So I'm sure that as you read it, you'll be making notes of what did we leave out. There's got to be some stuff. I've always been really interested in the agricultural and the ethnic festivals that happen in Utah, and that's one place where you really see food traditions on display. The festivals that are put together by ethnic groups to celebrate their heritage really showcase food as really the easiest way to build bridges between different groups. And think about the Greek festival and the plethora of food that's down there, that gigantic buffet that you can take advantage of every year, all made homemade by ladies all year long, saved in the big freezers down at the church and hauled out for the festival every September. And over the years, that festival has made everybody in Salt Lake and throughout the state, because there are other Greek festivals, aware of Greek culture, its beauty, and its food traditions. They're the way to open the door for understanding and respect. And just as a note, that Greek festival is so cool. They make a lot of money. They run programs at the church, but they give away most of that money to nonprofit causes. It's really a beautiful thing. Rural festivals, they're wonderful. They're all over the state. Many of them got started at the beginning of the 20th century as a way of marketing food. You know, like North Ogden was probably the first festival that purposely marketed their cherries, their tart cherries, and tried to get people to come to North Ogden to buy those. But the thing that fascinates me, or one of the things, is how many festivals continue, because they are a marker of identity. People are proud to be from Hooper, where we celebrate with Tomato Days, even though they haven't sold tomatoes commercially for decades. Same with Pleasant Grove and Strawberry Days. There are a number of these festivals where the crop that's being celebrated is no longer gone, but the identity persists. It's just like the beet diggers down in Jordan High School at the south part of Utah Valley. They are proud of the beet diggers, but I'll bet you there's not one kid who's got a beet digger logo on their t-shirt that has ever even seen a sugar beet, let alone dug one up. Food can be so powerful when it comes to identity. The last thing I want to mention is that we purposely placed all the wonderful essays about ethnic food in the heritage section, because they are all part of Utah's heritage. You want to underline that. The diversity of them is wonderful. The depth and the beauty and the tastiness of the food. And you know, you think about ethnic food and how popular that has become in the last few decades, and how much more widespread and available. And it's a wonderful meeting place for everybody in the state. Let's say, just in closing, I want to say it's been an honor to work with the other editors and with all the essayists, and thanks to the press, I'm so glad this is out. It's just a delight. Thank you.
Carol, it's Joanne Wong, and will you do a little panorama of your room so we can see what art you have?
Well, I can certainly do that very quickly. I think I can do that. Let's see. I don't know. Well, let's see. There's a Red Rock by Catherine Statz, Grosvenor's Arch by Ann Garrett. Another one, it's a pastel of Southern Utah by Ann Garrett. There is let's see, it's not Mabel Fraser, it's the other one. Oh gosh. North Ogden Canyon, absolutely gorgeous. Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Carol.
Mike, I have you next.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. I have to, as everybody will, I'm sure, I want to thank all of the editors and their hard work over these past handful of years, and all of the contributors. When I first learned, I guess, about the side, and I thought, you know, if I do anything here, I want to write about one of the iconic foods. Funeral potatoes or green Jell-O, or hopefully fry sauce. I really wanted to write about fry sauce because I kind of have this really strange, maybe not love-hate relationship with it, but a love kind of distance myself a little bit from it relationship. And I think a lot of it's not based on flavor or taste. If we were to go flavor or taste, I prefer things to be a little tangier, maybe a little bit more vinegary, so ketchup is more my style. But I started thinking about it, and as Carol just mentioned, and Eric did a little bit earlier, this love-dislike relationship I have with fry sauce has to do with identity. And that became pretty apparent early on. Eric's chapter that introduces the entire section actually starts with the sentence, "Utah has an identity problem." And that's something that I think Carol mentioned and we see come up, and it certainly did when I was talking about fry sauce and talking with people about fry sauce. And, you know, on the one hand, we could look at it and say, you know, all of us can share Utah's collective identity by enjoying an iconic food together, in this case, fry sauce. No matter who we are, where we're from, you know, it builds bridges, it unifies us. But there's also another side to it. And I guess I need to first preface by saying I'm not necessarily criticizing Utah or Utahns in any way. You know, my whole family lives here. I've chosen to live here. I was born here, went to school here. I love it here. But there are also some things about our home state that are a little bit troublesome, or curious at least. And when you talk about Utah, as Eric mentioned, you inevitably talk about Mormons and Utah's pioneer heritage. And that's quite often kind of a baseline or starting point for conversations. And there is sometimes a cultural divide there. And I think it's represented with something as seemingly everyday and mundane as a condiment known as fry sauce. But by highlighting this one symbol, in our case, fry sauce, you reveal something that means a whole lot more than we think it might. In fact, there's a couple quotes in the chapter that explores this. One by my sister-in-law and another by someone who answered one of the surveys I sent out. I can't recall off the top of my head, but the fact is, when you talk about food in Utah, you oftentimes will talk about that divide, and it's not always a friendly cultural divide. But that's the great thing about folklore, right? Well, we know that it's not trivial. Even something as innocuous as a condiment can be actually quite serious, and that's why this stuff matters. Highlighting fry sauce as one symbol means a whole lot more than we think it does. You know, it's not, it may be every day, but it's not fluff, it's not just trivial. And for me, I guess looking back at the chapter and thinking about, looking back on my experience growing up with fry sauce, were I to write it again, I maybe would even focus a little bit more on the idea of, you know, insider, outsider identity concerns. But instead, I took a broader approach and I hope people enjoy it. I really got into some origins, of course, and variants of ingredients. And, you know, the love-hate thing with fry sauce, my goodness, people were passionate about those topics as well. It's not trivial, right? No, I know who invented fry sauce for fact, or no, that's the wrong recipe. This is the exact recipe, and I would, you know, swear on a stack of Bibles that this is true. And we don't want to go into a 35-page chapter academic breakdown, as Lynn suggested, of that, although you could. But I hope that people read the chapter. I hope everybody gets the book and enjoys the book. Again, thanks to the editors and contributors. I just feel pleased that it's out. It's really good, and the breadth of it is just thorough and complete. And I feel pretty humbled and grateful to have been a part of it. So it's been a lot of fun.
Is it my turn now?
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm Cheney, and I'm here to talk about the heritage section of the book. Heritage, I guess, means stuff we received from the people who went before us. And so there's a lot of really old-fashioned-y stuff in this section of the book. I guess I came to this whole endeavor because I just released a book just previously, Plain But Wholesome, Foodways of the Mormon Pioneers. And it's all about Mormon pioneer food before the railroad in Utah. And so if we say Mormon pioneer, then probably we have this idea, like Michael was saying, that Mormon food is kind of this homogenous culture that pits Mormons against non-Mormons. And maybe there's some truth to that, in that, I don't know, people think Mormon food is kind of bland. I know when I was growing up, my mom never used garlic, ever. I was an adult in Utah before I figured out how to use garlic. And that's just kind of a symbol of how this perception of Mormon food can be bland. So I wrote this little section in the book to talk about some of the conceptions about Mormon food. And maybe it would all boil down to this food called lumpy dick. Dick is a kind of a pudding, basically. Lots of different dick recipes, like spotted dick or lumpy dick. And even the title of Moby Dick was a reference to this white whale that looked like a big pudding floating on top of the ocean. And so lumpy dick, basically one of the earliest times I ever heard of lumpy dick was with Nick Wilson's book, The White Indian Boy, now called Among the Shoshones. As this little boy who was grown up in Grantsville, Utah, and he recalled his diet in the Mormon fort in Grantsville as being boiled greens and lumpy dick. And it was because of this diet that he ran away to live with the Shoshones, because they had meat. And so the lumpy dick was basically just flour boiled in milk and not whisked out to any smooth consistency. And maybe, if you're lucky, a little bit of spice or sugar in it. But those are the kind of the preconceptions of Mormon food, is that kind of bland, pasty, flour and starchy stuff. But the nice thing about this section in the book is that it really does showcase quite a diversity of traditions in Utah's heritage. And there are examples from Italian immigrants and Greek immigrants and Japanese immigrants, Native Americans that were here before the Mormons and after the Mormons. And even within the Mormon picture, you've got Swiss settlers and Danish settlers and folks from Britain. In fact, one of the recipes I think of a lot is this recipe that came over from England with a woman who settled in Randolph, Utah, the heart of Utah, the coldest part of Utah. Anyway, she brought this recipe for hot cross buns from England. And hot cross buns is an Easter tradition that we don't really see very much amongst the Mormon communities, but that was the important thing for her to bring over. So anyway, I guess that's what I wanted to say about the heritage section, is that there's a whole lot more here. And even during pioneer times, there's a whole lot more here than pasty white Mormons. There's all kinds of things going on from a lot of different traditions. And that's this book is full of it. And I'm happy to be a part of it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kathryn MacKay, and I am delighted to be part of this. Thanks to the editors, thanks to the press, thanks to all the contributors. This is a wonderful text. The two essays that I wrote are in the section on Latter-day Saint influences, and I want to just talk about one. This was a project that Carol handed off to me, thankfully, was to write about a rather famous cookbook that circulated. Oh, my grandmother had a copy of it. My aunt had a copy of it. And this was the cookbook, How to Be Well, that was written by Leah Woodstow. And she came from there was Susie and Gates, and she married well. Her husband Woodstow was president of both of Utah State and eventually the University of Utah. But the point of the text is that it was written by someone who was very committed to domestic science and nutrition, and very keen on bringing all the scientific data that she could to this cookbook. And it was a wonderful project to write about. In this section about Latter-day Saint influences, I want to highlight two sections. One by Randy Williams on food storage. And it's a delightful chapter, and it includes advice that her grandmother gave her to only use curd jars, and a discussion that is both academic and classically folklorish in its stories and its tales. I really strongly recommend this section on food storage. And then one more by Elaine Clark, which is about postum. Postum is a drink that my mother drank. I hated the taste of postum. She kept trying to foist it on me. It was ghastly. But it's a beverage that actually wasn't invented by the Mormons. It was invented by Post and the Seventh-day Adventist traditions, but it came into Utah. It was embraced by the Mormons as part of their word of wisdom. And Elaine Clark does a wonderful job of talking about this outside beverage that comes into Utah and becomes identified so much with Latter-day Saints and the word of wisdom. And although Post stopped making postum years ago, another company picked it up and has perpetuated the myth of postum, that it's good for you and it tastes good, and and it's part of the Latter-day influence. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm next. And I just want to join with everyone else in thanking the press and the editors. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to have something appear in this wonderful book. I also want to mention thanks to my co-author, Roger Baker, who passed away several years ago. He was a professor of mine and became a neighbor. My kids and his grandkids are very good friends, and just it was a really nice opportunity for me a few weeks ago to give a copy of the book to his family and to remember him. And our article appears in part 4, local specialties. And as I received the book and saw the section, I just couldn't help but think about Highway 89. This road that just goes through the center of Utah, and almost everything in this section can touch on Highway 89 or places along Highway 89, from Bear Lake area and the berries, and there's chapters about traditions in Logan, to the Fruitway in Box Elder County, and that just always reminds me of growing up in Davis County. near Cherry Hill and eating cherries off the trees. We played there in the summers, and the fruit stands that would go along the highways. But Highway 89 continues down into central and southern Utah as well. And our article is about Sanpete County and Sanpete, Turkey, which I'll talk about in a minute, but even down to some great articles about wine in southern Utah and Dixie salad, which Carol talked about as well. And of course, there's other parts of Utah as well. And so the really good articles about Creek chili sauce and the pickle pie from Bicknell, which is just south of where I live in Ephraim. But our article specifically talks about Sanpete County, and it's a one beautiful place to live. I teach at a college there, and in the county, what really captured my attention or caught my attention as I wrote this article was this self-narrative about what the county is, where it came from. And of course, this is a narrative that can be more complicated if you look at historical trends and different perspectives on the land, which was Ute land before the Mormon settlers arrived. And but the three main parts that I see about the self-narrative about Sanpete County, or even the identity of Sanpete County, to tie into what some of our other presenters have talked about. It's that it's Scandinavian. The Scandinavian settlers from the LDS Church were sent there, and scholars have documented even into the mid-20th century, there would be Mormon worship services conducted in Danish. The county is also takes pride in its ruralness, and it also has like other parts of Utah, a real predominant power structure in the Mormon Church. And each of those identities or parts of the Sanpete identity are reflected in these food traditions. And so we focused on times in which this marinated turkey is made, and the performances of it, because one of the things that folklorists can offer to situations like this is to point out that the recipe itself isn't the folklore, or necessarily all of the folklore, but it's the performance of the recipe. It's the cooking of it and the sharing of it and the meaning behind that really reveals a lot about the people who choose to use that recipe. And three quick examples of where we see these identities in Sanpete County. Ephraim has every year Scandinavian days, where people dress up like Vikings, and there's parades and a celebration of the Danish heritage that's in Sanpete County. Roger Baker told me this joke that I always remember. He said that there's three types of people in Sanpete County. There's the SONs, the SENs, and the SOBs. And as someone with a non-Scandinavian last name, I always feel like I'm a little bit on the outside in Sanpete County in Scandinavian days. Another performance arena for these, for Sanpete, Turkey, is the Manti pageant that the LDS Church put on for 50 years in Manti. And Manti, the church in Manti, and then later the city, would produce these huge Sanpete turkey dinners that, because you would get 10, 20,000 people coming to this tiny town of a couple thousand, would overwhelm the restaurants. And so the Sanpete turkey was a big part of that festival. And then also I'm at Snow College, which is a small college in central Utah, but we pull a lot of students from the Wasatch Front. And on October 1st, around that time every year, the sheep herders will bring the sheep down they've been grazing in the mountains, and they'll bring them down to take them out to the West Campus, or the West Desert. And it's always fun to see the Wasatch Front students just gawk at the sheep coming down literally next to the college. And rural divide, suburban rural divide, is just apparent in everyday life in Sanpete County. the last point I want to make is just to tie in with one of the reviewers of the book made the point that Richard Raspa said that this book shows that Utah is so much more than just the stereotypes. And each of these three performance types that I've talked about with Sanpete turkey are also complicated and changing. The turkey plant that is in Sanpete County, where they raise turkeys and export them, for years employed mostly Latino workers, and the Latino presence in the county is something that just enriches the communities. Recently, there was a big push, and the company brought in workers from Samoa. A tuna factory closed down in Samoa, and those workers have come to the county as well. Again, adding richness and diversity, but it changes the image of like the 20th century turkey farmer and turkey plant. The LDS Church ended the Manti pageant. Last year was the first year without that, and that's going to make a difference in, I think, where people eat Sanpete turkey and what it's known for and its prevalence. And then even just with COVID and it shut down the Scandinavian festival last year, and we'll hope that we can return to that in the future. But what all of those things point out to me is just something that, again, that folklorists are really good at illustrating, is that even though there are traditions, and we think of traditions as a connection to the past and unchanging, there's nothing more dynamic than a tradition as it keeps getting re-performed and reintroduced in our everyday lives.
Thank you. And that keys in perfectly to my section, which is Foodways Today. And I wanted to start out by mentioning that this book is dedicated to Bert Wilson, who was a mentor of many of us. And he and another mentor, Barry Tolkien, would emphasize that folklore is not just in the past. It's something that if it isn't relevant, it won't keep happening. And so it may be surprising when you hear that I am a folklorist and I was writing about the Cafe Rio and Costa Vida Fresh Max Wars. I was at the Black Sheep Cafe lunch where this book was started. I am grateful that I was at a different end of the table, because it's been a complex editorial process, and I will echo my gratitude to the editors. And I don't know if it was at that lunch or as it started developing that I got to think about my connection with Cafe Rio and the controversy with Costa Vida. For me, this, as with many, there's a personal connection. My first taste of Cafe Rio was not at the restaurant Cafe Rio, but at a restaurant that I say in my essay is so defunct now that the building is even torn down. I was at a family birthday dinner, and my brother-in-law's brother made this awesome food that I later learned came from his work at Cafe Rio. And I hadn't had black beans since I had served my mission in Guatemala. And I learned that there was a restaurant, and I loved that moment where you had to pick black or pinto beans. And I think Dave mentioned performance. The restaurant figured out how to make ordering food a bit of a performance as well. But I had heard that Costa Vida, which actually started out Costa Azul, had stolen the whole concept from Cafe Rio. And since I first experienced from someone who worked at Cafe Rio, I already had my side. And so when we were talking about Utah food, I wanted to write about this. And I just want to read a teeny bit from my essay that also explains why, as a folklorist, I felt qualified to write about this. 4 interrelated areas infused by tradition spark my interest in folklorist as a folklorist and make this skirmish important to Utah Foodways: region, rumor, community, and creativity. So I got to do different kinds of research than I had done. I was looking at online sources. I was looking at newspaper articles. I didn't actually look up legal briefs, but this case made it to the courts. And I don't know how it was resolved. I've had a student recently tell me that Costa Vida won the war because they have more franchises. I maintain my connection to Cafe Rio. My piece relates with a couple others in this Foodways Today section. They're on the level of rumor and contention. There's a Mrs. Fields article, and we've heard about recipes, and so that becomes part of that essay. And then also we have soda pop wars in this section, the Swig and Sodalicious, which seems rather familiar to the Cafe Rio Costa Vida debates, and have actually made it to court cases. In this section, there also is another theme, though, that I want to emphasize as I close, and I think of this as from the source. So the source may be reminding us that food comes from the earth, or a do-it-yourself attitude toward food and beverage, or the source, home and memory. So we have essays and chapters about the artisan chocolate businesses that are prevalent in Utah, farmers markets, the local food scene, which may be anywhere in Utah, but also old-time food and refugee food, which I think is on purpose the last essay in the book to remind us about the diversity of Utah food traditions. And so once again, I want to thank you, thank my family, and I've already given them a spoiler alert that they're getting the book for Christmas. Thanks.
That's great. We do have a couple of questions. One was on Twitter this morning, and it was about funeral potatoes. And are funeral potatoes if they don't have cornflakes on them? If anyone would like to answer that. I'm a cornflake girl. Mine always have cornflakes.
That's in one of the sections I edited, so maybe I ought to take that one. And one of the things that folklorists do, it's not our job to adjudicate these matters. We observe and we get excited when we find out people arguing about what the definition of a thing is. What are the essential features? And it's interesting that whoever asked this question, they indeed put their finger right on the thing that seems to exercise most people about funeral potatoes. And more than once I heard, look, it's got to have, well, if not cornflakes, something crispy on the top. Otherwise, you're making au gratin potatoes, and that's something else. And what we're doing here is funeral potatoes, and that might actually be the thing that makes it funeral potatoes rather than something else. But no community's ever 100%. And like on this sort of thing, and like I said, it's just our job as folklorists to report how the debate seems to be going rather than what really is.
One of the, I'm going to jump in. I was reminded that one of the recipes in there actually has sour cream and onion potato chips as the crunchy part. So
that's very common too. It's got something crunchy. Doesn't have to be cornflakes.
There's one thing I'd like to mention, possible. This is Carol. And that's just that with the Olympics coming in 2002 and preparing for that, you'll notice that the Olympic food pins are all throughout the book as kind of a theme. I think that's the time when Utahns became much more self-aware of food traditions. And just as a simple example, I always knew you went to a funeral and had au gratin potatoes and ham, but it wasn't until a colleague gave me a recipe for yummy funeral potatoes in the late 90s that I realized that it had become this other thing. And I think that growing of self-awareness about food traditions and how they reflect and represent our Utah identity, it was really tied in with the Olympics.
Great answers.
To add on there a little bit, it seems that Utahns think that funeral potatoes are a specifically Utah thing. But of course, there's lots of other places around the country that call funeral potatoes their own thing. And the same thing goes for green Jell-O with shaved carrots in it. There's plenty of other places in the Midwest that own green Jell-O with carrots. But somehow we all each individually think that it's our thing.
That's all great. This next question was asked repeatedly by different people, but what were some surprising foods or surprising things you found in your research?
I'll talk on this one really quick. Most surprising to me was to find that there were fresh oysters, fresh live oysters in Utah in 1868, that people were eating oysters on the half shell in Utah in 1868.
If I could jump in again too, I'll tell you one thing that was surprising to me, and that's that fry sauce is not everywhere. I had no idea. I grew up with fry sauce. That's what we eat on French fries. It took till, I don't know, sometime in the 90s when a folklore colleague from another state, Andrea Graham, said something about, oh, I miss that fry sauce in Utah. And I'm like, well, why? Isn't it everywhere? That was a big surprise for me.
I think one of the big surprises for me was sort of digging into, I wrote the chapter on alcohol, which we did intentionally put as the first chapter of the iconic food section of Utah to, you know, break with expectation perhaps, but how long the history of alcohol in the state of Utah really is. I wrote the short section on Dixie wine, which, you know, was Southern Utah wineries in the 19th century. And it was eye-opening. I found in the Fife Folklore Archives folk songs about, you know, I mean, people sort of, you know, tipsily walking from house to house and sampling the goods that different families were producing. And, you know, I also wrote, clearly you see a pattern here, right? I also wrote the chapter on Pie and Beer Day, the contemporary corollary to Pioneer Day. And I had no idea that there's a similar spirit of convivial alcoholism in Utah at the turn of the century. And I learned a whole lot that I chose an opening series of notes to the alcohol chapter going back to the late 1800s all the way up to 2012. You know, journalists' comments that you think Utah's dry, but it turns out it's not. Apparently that's the only thing we've all been saying about Utah for like 200 years.
Along those lines, Lynn, the thing that might have surprised me most was when looking through the book and looking at the picture that you have of Jacob Hamblin's home in Santa Clara, and there are still sea wine grapes growing there at his house. So that's, you know, history has long tendrils that push and continue into the present in interesting ways. Oh, she froze.
And to go along with that, I was thinking when I did my research about pioneer foodways, that if we went back to the 1850s, we'd see a more pure form of Mormonism expressed through food. But really, their food was just as indulgent in alcohol and coffee and tea as anything you might imagine. That the Mormonism didn't seem to affect even the earliest pioneers as far as what they ate or didn't eat.
It's always
Can I jump in?
amazing to me. Just you think these food, of course you think of the green Jell-O and the fruit and potatoes and the fry sauce, but just how deep and rich the history of food in Utah is. One thing that was a little surprising to me, I think I read in Brock's book, and Brock, correct me if I'm wrong, but pioneers used to put a little bit of dirt or rocks in their pies to maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I read something in your book about putting dirt or rocks in pies to bring back the hardship of the trail. Is that correct?
Well, I remember there was one story about a pioneer who in the early days had to eat sago bulbs because there wasn't much to eat. And so then as he was getting to be an older man, and he would gather his grandchildren annually and cook sago bulbs for them, just so that they would know the tough things that he had to do. And so it was a way of passing on this food tradition, but in a whole different spirit than what he experienced it as a young man.
Great. We actually need to wrap up, but I did see in the comments to give a shout out to John Alley, who has just recently retired. Well, recently, it's been, I guess, a couple of years now, from the University of Utah Press, and he is one that helped put this book together. So we'd like to give a shout out to John Alley. I'm not sure if he's on this call or not. But I would like to thank everybody for attending. This was a really interesting event, and I was really excited about this book. And feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I will pass them along to the contributors. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. It's been great.